Chapter 2 Elara's Homecoming. Part 1 A Meeting of Friends. It was still dark when Elara broke camp that morning. As a priestess of Anya who had only recently completed her training, rising before the sun was her habit. However, something more than habit had her up and going extra early this morning. Today was the final leg of a months-long journey. In only a few hours, she would finally be home, a place she had missed every hour of every day for the past 6 years. She was both anxious and eager to see the village again, and every step closer heightened those competing emotions. Uncle Diarmid would have her old room ready for her just the way she'd left it. Tonight, she would wash away the dirt and grime of her journey and sleep on a real mattress for the first time in years. Yet, she knew there would be little time to rest. Diarmid's most recent letters had overflowed with his joy at her coming return, and he was sure to have plans for a celebration and invite the entire village. And the entire village would show. No one else in 5 counties put on a spread like Squire Diarmid Morgan, and the celebration of her return would be the kind people talked about for years to come. There would also be a constant stream of visitors, and dinner invitations would follow from the established families in the area, particularly those with unmarried sons and parents who would consider her occupation and her complete lack of interest in marriage to be a minor technicality. Nor did Elara expect much time to rest when she wasn't visiting or being visited. Cormac would be eager to know how much his former pupil had grown in her skills, and the old druid would likely insist she accompany him on his rounds. Cormac would be proud, showing her off as he would his own child, but would he be impressed? Would she live up to the incredibly high expectations that she presumed he had for her? She worried, too, about how the rest of the villagers would see her. In a community that small, neighbors are more like extended family, and families may still see the child even when dealing with the adult. On entering any other village, she would be venerated. Her attire and the amulet of Anya that hung around her neck would mark her as someone who commanded respect. Here in the country, the druids, priests, and priestesses of Anya served as healers, veterinarians, horticulturalists, teachers, counselors, and even informal mediators and magistrates. Any possible need involving learning or care often fell to them. In her own village, though, she would still be Diarmid's Elara, Cormac's Elara, brave little Elara who was so patient with the livestock and could calm a child's fever with a touch. Loved, yes, and in a way respected, yet still a child. She wondered how they would respond to the woman Elara, to priestess Elara, who would try to show them new methods for planting and offer new remedies even Cormac had never heard of. It's such a strange soup stewing in my head, Elara thought to herself as she walked unhurried amid the familiar trees that converged around the final miles of her journey, basking in the same morning sun that, at that moment, was just beginning to warm Phelan and Buddy as they took their seats outside a nearby cottage. As she mused, Elara became suddenly aware of a group of young men rounding a bend in the road up ahead. She knew they were from her village, not just from their direction of travel, but also because they were all familiar to her, one in particular uninvitingly so.
Elara, is that you?
She heard Duncan call out in his superior yet whiny voice.
Hello, Duncan,
Elara replied with all the pleasantness she could muster. Her lips were a woman's smile, the inoffensive and demure kind of thing women habitually employ to calm predatory tendencies in petulant men. In any other situation, meeting Duncan and his friends would have been unpleasant. Seeing the boy who had made so many unsuccessful attempts to court her out here, far from anyone and anything, and in the presence of his pack, she felt old terrors resurfacing. Yet a lifetime of practice at being a girl and a woman had made her an expert at hiding her true feelings.
Well then, I guess the princess has returned,
Duncan declared with a snort. Elara offered no visible response. Duncan's companions, however, laughed like he had made an actual joke rather than simply alluding to an insult. The courage their laughter gave him was readily apparent as he strode at Elara with increasing confidence. She stopped and tried to keep her posture natural as he approached, but she could not help the instinctive stiffening of her spine as her body screamed for escape. When he reached her and invaded her body space, the strain with which she held her smile began to show.
What's this then?
He asked, reaching out and taking hold of her amulet of Anya as if her body and property were public domain. He looked up into her eyes and smiled when he saw the fear betrayed there.
So, did you actually earn this? Or did Uncle Diarmid buy it for you?
He continued in a mock girlish voice. Elara's mask finally cracked.
I always knew you were an uncouth fool, Duncan, but I think you'd have enough piety to keep your hands off of a priestess. Have you no respect for the gods?
As soon as the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Not because they were wrong, but because remonstrating men like Duncan is like smacking a rabid dog. Some creatures cannot be dealt with by reason. Duncan's expression went cold. He grabbed Elara's arm with his free hand, squeezing down on her bicep with all his strength in a petty show of dominance. He whispered, low and threatening, yet still with that ever-present whine.
Don't you dare lecture me about respect, you.
His voice trailed off as he searched for the right words, the strain of the task visible in his eyes. Elara, for a moment, imagined Duncan's mind as a little mouse with its tail caught in something, madly running at full speed but going nowhere. She could not help but crack a smile at the representative image of Duncan's mental prowess. The wheedling edge in his voice did not help.
You think I'm funny?
He tried to threaten, his eyes darting back to gauge his friend's reactions. He moved in, his face close enough that Elara could feel the heat of his words on her cheek. His voice turned sickeningly sweet, taking on that grotesque tone men use when mixing innuendo as threats.
Maybe I should give you something to really smile about. Maybe that would dislodge the stick you have lodged up your...
Duncan did not get the chance to finish his sentence. The implied threat was enough, and Elara hit him with an explosion of magical power that sent Duncan flying back with an oof. He tried to stand and gather himself, doing his best to shake off the feeling he'd just been punched in the gut by a bear. He let loose a string of the usual epithets men like him use to describe the place they believe a woman need be put in, then turned angrily to his friends, all of whom were standing around with their mouths agape.
What the hell is wrong with you? Grab her!
Duncan roared.
We're going to teach her a thing or two about respect.
A few hundred yards away into the forest, Duncan's yelling set Buddy into motion. In fairness to Feline, had he as sensitive ears as the cat and been able to make out the words, he'd have likely responded the same. After all, we are not who we are in our well-thought-out moments. We are who we are when we act without thinking. As previously observed, Duncan's friend did not present Elara with much of a challenge. As they approached her, she released an even larger nova burst that sent 3 of them sprawling. That left 2 attackers still in the fight. Duncan, who was still staggering to his feet as he pulled a knife from his sheath on his belt, and the friend who had stopped to help him. This was a small problem. Elara had used most of her strength on that second burst and now had to back away while she recovered enough for another cast. Her retreat emboldened Duncan and his compatriot as they made a run at her. That was when Buddy appeared, charging from the woodline like an avenging ghost, the last glow of his transformation still fading from his snow-white fur. His appearance alone was enough to make both men hesitate, and when he pounced at Duncan and took him back to the ground, the only thing that kept the other man from running was the weakness that fear had visited on his limbs. Fear had tried to visit a weakness on his mind as well, but on encountering his mental faculties, found the effort redundant. Elara did not know how to react. One of her would-be attackers was still on his feet, but she was unsure whether he was the real threat at this point. She was no stranger to cougars and wolves, but Buddy was something on a whole different scale. For all she knew, she was next. As her instincts took over, unconscious calculations decided a prone man was more inviting target than a woman on her feet, prompting a cast that knocked the final assailant down. Once he was on the ground and Buddy was eyeing him, though, her better nature began a war with her instincts. She couldn't just run away while the man was mauled to death, regardless of what his intent had been for her. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a spell she knew that would subdue the hulking cat and not just anger it. At that moment, an unfamiliar voice behind and to her right sent Elara's adrenaline-addled thoughts screeching to a halt. When her eyes turned that direction, they found what appeared to be a well-armed man making a come-here motion with his hand as he spoke. The words didn't register, but he seemed to be talking to the lion, or tiger, or whatever it was. She caught the cat moving out of the corner of her eye and raised her hands, ready to cast some defensive spell, even though she still had no idea what spell she could use on the beast. When she saw it was going for the stranger, she still came within a hair's breadth of firing off the first spell that came to mind. Fortunately, brains move faster than thought, and Elara's brain quickly assessed the factors of the situation. The man had drawn no weapon, the cat was bouncing like a puppy as it bounded toward him, and while the man seemed alarmed, he did not appear fearful. 100 imperceptible calculations took place too quickly to call them anything other than a feeling, but that feeling told Elara the man was in no danger. As the cat knocked the man to the ground and the two lavished loving attention on one another, Elara wasn't sure what to think. She had seen plenty of odd and unusual sights in the past few years, both on her travels and during her training to be a priestess. However, she had never seen anything quite like Buddy, his mouth still red with Duncan's blood, standing on top of Phelan while the two rubbed their noses together. Yet, Elara had an educated mind. To such a mind, encounters with strange things are challenges and invitations to discovery. Perhaps even more so when those strange things are more than a bit unsettling. In fact, she would prove to these two particular strange and unsettling things just how up to the challenge she was. She would stride right over there and show them that it would take more than an armed man suddenly appearing with a giant white tiger of some sort to truly unsettle Elara Morgan. And so she strode toward them with an air of confidence and authority. They did not seem to notice. She continued to stride, making sure to add extra authority to each step, and soon found herself standing over the two, close enough she could have reached out and stroked the fluff at the corners of Buddy's ears. They continued to nuzzle. She considered whether to clear her throat or make some similar noise, but after a moment to reflect, chose instead to ask, in the most matter-of-fact tone she could muster.
So, I assume this tiger's with you?
Had she not still been fairly shaken, Elara might have laughed at the response she received as the pair looked up at her in unison. They both wore a kind of surprised expression unique to their common gender, a strangely innocent look that communicates both the suspicion it has done something wrong and complete cluelessness as to what that something might be. Depending on that situation, that look can be infuriating. In that moment, however, Elara found it endearing, more so from the cat than from the man, yet still endearing all around. As the man got to his feet, his less than committal
You could say that.
did not do much to elucidate matters. But her question wasn't really about elucidation anyway.
Well, he likes a good fight, so...
The man continued, as if a predilection towards violence was either unusual for large predators with big teeth or unobvious from the events leading up to that point. Elara responded with a polite,
Apparently.
already not terribly concerned with the man's approach to conversation or what he was attempting to communicate with his rambling. Buddy, on the other hand, had her full attention. When Elara looked down at the big cat, she was met with the deepest eyes she had ever seen. Elara loved animals, all of them, even the dangerous ones. Maybe the dangerous ones a bit more, to be honest. All her life, she had been fascinated by wolves and bears and carnivores in general, but most of all by the big cats. Once as a young girl, she had come within a few feet of a cougar, unaware it was there until she caught its eyes staring out at her. She'd frozen, locked in terrified fascination with those eyes, and if not for Uncle Diarmid, those eyes might have been the last thing she ever saw. Looking into Buddy's eyes, the experience was entirely different. She felt calm looking into those eyes, and safe. She could have sworn there was a different kind of intelligence there, something more like the intelligence you find in human eyes, perhaps even more. No, definitely more than you find in some human eyes. She reached out her hand tentatively, falling back on her instincts for dealing with domesticated cats rather than the wild kind. Buddy's head dropped like a friendly dog in response, and he began to move toward her with a relaxed, easy gait. Elara had to suppress a delighted giggle. Watching the pulsing, hypnotic movement of muscle and fur as he walked toward her, she felt a breathless anticipation. She extended her hand a little more, eager to feel that soft fur against her fingers. Elara immediately regretted everything. As Buddy leapt through the air at her, all the happily relaxed parts of her brain that had been fascinated by this beautiful creature were overrun by all the parts that were now tearing around in circles and screaming at each other. She stumbled back as a startled sound escaped her lips that her brain, for reasons related to dignity and the like, chose not to record. The shock of that moment was replaced in quick succession by multiple new surprises. The first came as Elara watched Buddy's huge form shrink so quickly it seemed he meant to disappear. The next was when she found she was now holding what, by all appearances, was a domesticated, long-haired cat that she had caught out of sheer instinctive reaction. At later times, Elara would acknowledge the possibility that she made another sound of some sort when she found herself holding a purring cat instead of being knocked to the ground by a lion. She, for her part, did not recall. As far as the smile Phelan would wear when bringing up the subject, Alara's usual response involved a colorful invitation regarding activities Phelan could engage in by himself, followed by,
I don't care. Buddy's adorable.
She could not disagree when Phelan continued his statements of the obvious with,
Buddy's a bit unusual.
But, again, she was holding a cat that, by every indication, found her delightful, and Phelan could have been a tree for all she cared.
That he is,
she said absently, all of her attention on the purring bundle of fur cradled in her arms. When she scratched the spot between Buddy's ears, his deepening purrs sent shivers through her very soul. When he pushed his head up into her palm, she was ready to turn and simply walk away with him, and the armed stranger be damned. Yet, no one understands better than a woman the great expanses of distance between things we want to do and the things that we do. Elara sighed internally and called her attention back to the world outside of the cat she held. She noticed the stranger seemed almost displeased with the moment as she was. That warmed her to his presence, as did the fact that he was watching Buddy rather than her and wearing a kind of sad, wistful smile. It's the littlest things that tell you the most about a person.
That's an interesting name. Buddy,
she said, trying to be polite, but also curious about the unusual sounding name. It was clearly foreign, but she could not place the language among any of the dozen or so with which she was familiar.
What language is that?
I guess it's mine?
The stranger said, continuing his streak of noncommittal responses, the uncertainty of the statement mirrored by the delivery.
It's sort of a long story, and there's parts of it I still don't know.
For the scientific mind, there is as much happiness in finding interesting questions to ask as there is in the answers, and Elara had a very scientific mind. Yet even her love of the unknown was beginning to be taxed a bit by the stranger's responses. She shot him a purposeful look, intended to encourage him to come up with something better. He responded with a noise like an old gate that needs oil, and Elara remained silent, hoping the awkwardness of the moment might encourage something useful to pop out of his brain.
Is just what I started calling him?
The man finally said with a shrug.
At least that's the simplest explanation.
Sometimes all you can do is laugh, or so the sages say. Elara had to admit to herself the man's befuddlement seemed genuine. For that matter, he seemed something of an overflowing font of genuineness. As the full cornucopia of odd and ridiculous and frightening and comforting and delightful and confusing elements sprawled out before her, like Duncan's groaning friends, who were still rather dramatically recuperating on the roadway, she could find no other response than laughter. Elara decided she liked the stranger. She flashed him an accepting, almost conspiratorial smile, turning it to Buddy before it became unseemly. As she continued to stroke the magical spot between the cat's ears, she sighed to herself and said,
Well, I don't know why, but I think it fits him.
Part 2. Strange Companions. The first person anyone meets in this life is themselves. Yet, the day we leave this world, we will still be learning things about even that earliest acquaintance. In that light, meeting strangers can be a bit daunting. So, when we encounter someone with whom we share a kindred disposition, the realization that we may be able to shortcut a few steps between strangers and friends is a welcome relief. Though many of life's rules related to longevity did not apply to Buddy, the relief at finding people he could tolerate was not lessened by the fact. For the most part, he liked people. He was that kind of cat, when he got down to it. People are generally warm and easily convinced to hold small, furry animals close to their body heat. Buddy enjoyed being warm, so he liked people, for the most part. Besides that, Buddy had discovered over the years that those people he did not like typically bothered him less once he had applied a liberal dose of claws and teeth, and the entertainment that said activity provided him often made up for the prior annoyance. However, this human, this Elara, he found strangely alluring in a way few humans ever were, On an honest scale from Phelan to fleas, she was right up there with Phelan. Depending on whether she was carrying any dried venison with her and her attitudes about sharing, he might even consider reordering the scale. But he knew all of this in moments, as animals often do. He even knew, as he leaped into her arms, that she was precisely the kind of human who would happily catch him and hold him until he had had his fill of attention. When she proceeded to walk away with him, evidently wishing to examine the corpses of her fallen foes, Buddy approved, both of her walking away with him and of the examination of the defeated host. It is always best to ensure those who trouble you are certain to never trouble you again. That was his motto anyway. He was less approving when she set him down as she began to examine Duncan, the human he had neatly dispatched. Well, not completely dispatched. The creature was still alive, in a technical way. But he did not care for Duncan. When he emerged from the forest earlier, Buddy had immediately spotted the metal claw-like thing Duncan was pulling from its sheath. He knew what those were for, and that Duncan clearly meant to use it on Elara. From his perspective, the man's life was forfeit the moment he'd made that choice. Humans, of course, are not as sensible as cats, Buddy reflected. They are given to any number of sentimental proclivities when it comes to whether or not people deserve to have their lives saved. Buddy cocked his head with curiosity as he watched Elara reach out her hand to the wound on Duncan's neck. The palm of her hand began to glow, and Buddy could not help being fascinated by the way the man's skin pulled together and closed. Still, the effort did seem a waste. A man like this was certain to meet some kind of violent end eventually. At least Buddy hoped so. Buddy looked back to check on Phelan and saw that his preferred human was following suit with Elara, checking on the less injured men and helping them to their feet. Buddy sighed to himself when he heard Phelan giving the men stern warnings about their future conduct. Humans had such strange trust in the impact of words on the mentally deaf. Ah, well, that's what you get for loving humans, right? They are silly creatures, but often lovely regardless, even without counting the magical things they can accomplish with their opposable thumbs. As Elara finished healing Duncan, Phelan approached and helped the still-dazed man to his feet, as if assisting the man instead of leaving him to moan pathetically in the road was not silly enough. Phelan handled him as gently as an injured bird. Well, as gently as humans handle injured birds, to be clear. Getting Duncan to his feet, Phelan handed him off to two of his companions who had remained a few respectful feet back and away from Elara. The men both now looked at the priestess Vanya with a kind of fear that Buddy appreciated. It warmed him in the way cuddling up to Phelan at night warmed him, and he felt inspired to rub his head against one of Elara's ankles to demonstrate how proud he was of his new friend. As he did so, he caught one of the men looking at him with a confused eye, then a glance to Phelan. "What is that your cat, Phelan?" the man stuttered. He gave Buddy another distrustful look, then darted his eyes around, apparently looking for the beast that had attacked Duncan. "He's not," the man trailed off, as if hoping someone would finish this sentence. Phelan and Elara side-eyed one another, then gave the man a somewhat patronizing version of a questioning look in tandem. What's that?" Phelan asked the man, knowing full well what had him so confused. "Never mind," the man muttered, shaking his head and looking away. Phelan cleared his throat, getting the attention of the battle-weary foes gathered around. "So," he began in what Buddy guessed he thought was an authoritative tone, "I may be fairly new to the area, but I am not new to idiots. As such, I have no doubt there are already any number of inadvisable thoughts running through your heads." Phelan paused to let the words sink in, glancing around at the men to gauge their reactions. One or two sneered, making Buddy wish he could roll his eyes the way humans do. By his estimations, these humans were the sort that didn't learn fire is hot even after sticking their whole hand in it. He tried to get Phelan's attention, offering his loudest meow. Phelan looked down at Buddy and saw Buddy's opinion on the matter displayed on his face as clearly as if they'd had a telepathic connection. By the same token, Buddy knew Phelan was not interested in his thoughts on what should be done with the men, and he knew as well that the words Phelan responded with were not for his benefit. "No, Buddy," Phelan said, looking straight at the cat. "We aren't going to kill them." Then added after the appropriate pause, "Not this time." For his own benefit, Buddy answered with a discontented little growl, forgetting that, in his present form, it was more likely adorable than threatening. Still, it gave him the closest he could come to the kind of satisfaction humans feel when rolling their eyes, something that, if he had been able to do it, would have had his eyes rolling full out of his head by now. For her part, Elara simply offered the man a wide smile. Looking up at her and noticing this, Buddy gave her ankle another approving rub. Words are a waste, showing a little teeth. Now that makes sense. As the men wobbled down the road toward whatever their intended destination had been, the preferable humans began making more words at one another. From what Buddy could tell, more than half the sounds a human ever emits serve no other purpose than to make a noise. That ratio skyrockets when humans are new to one another, with the number of pointless questions and obvious observations reaching dizzying proportions. The first meeting of Elara and Feline was no exception to the rule, although Buddy did notice approvingly that the new human was much more economical with her nonsense than Feline. Still, Buddy reflected, his human was cute in a way, and that made up for a lot. A lot of cats don't get what people cats see in the creatures. Buddy had found that, if you give humans a chance, they just kind of work their way into your heart, and Feline, though that name wasn't his real name, had long ago found a special place in Buddy's.
So, Carlem's old cottage? That's where you came from?
Elara was asking as Buddy tuned back into the conversation. At Phaline's nod, Elara continued,
You must know my uncle then.
Phaline's face contorted in a series of expressions from interest to curiosity to sudden recognition. Wait, are you Elara? He asked with eager astonishment, as if he'd just been introduced to the queen. You're Diarma's niece, Elara.
I am,
she said.
But that doesn't really help me in terms of figuring out who you are.
No, I suppose it wouldn't, Feline responded with a matter-of-fact laugh. I'm sure the last letter Diarma sent you was long before I even arrived in the area. Buddy's human then extended a hand in Elara's direction, held it there for an awkward moment, then withdrew it again as if confused why he'd even made the gesture. My name's Feline. Diarma, well, he's kind of taken me under his wing ever since I showed up here. Sensibly, Elara did not respond, instead giving Feline a look that invited him to continue explaining. But he had to admit, she wasn't cat-sensible, but for a human, she was surprisingly cat-like. Honestly, listen, you clearly have places to be, as it were, and this is going to take a while to explain. Why don't I just walk with you to the village? It would be good to see Diarma anyway, Feline said, gesturing down the road to indicate the direction of recommended travel. Rudely enough, the humans then began to walk away without so much as picking Buddy up. In their defense, he thought to himself, it was as likely absent-mindedness as rudeness. One downside of their endless exchanges of noise is that humans often forget the important things while they are gabbing away about the pointless ones. Buddy got their attention easily enough with a plaintive cry that was sure to split their hearts in two. He was pleased to see that the new human was even more responsive than his own human. But he had to hand it to her. This Elara was a fast learner, as humans go. At Buddy's cry, Elara spun around as quick as a human could, and with a series of unintelligible sounds surrounding statements like,
Oh, Buddy, poor baby.
And,
I'm so sorry.
Swooped down and scooped Buddy up in her arms before Feline could even react. Nuzzling into the cradle of her arms, Buddy was once again considering whether or not Feline may just be getting displaced in his personal hierarchy of humans. End of Chapter 2.